one of their principal foods. You see a gentleman, an old friend of mine, Jim Range, holding a rockfish there at Fletcher's Cove on the Potomac. Rockfish also would eat them, both in the rivers and out in the ocean. And then as they come into the rivers, they're very important to the rivers because a variety of things eat them, from the eagles, which build their nests and lay their eggs in February so that the eggs hatch during the migratory fish runs, ospreys, smallmouth bass will eat the young shad. The young shad, after they hatch, out-migrate in September, October time period. And so they're food for smallmouth bass and the young smallmouth bass too, or largemouth bass. Crabs eat the shad that succumb to the spawning stress. But the biggest predator to shad in the Potomac River is that little fish in the, or minnows. Minnows eat the eggs and larvae of the shad. So the shad strategy is to come in mass, lay a lot of eggs, have a lot of larvae, sort of satiate the minnow population, and so that more offspring of the minnows can eat. But that energy that they bring in, the eggs with the protein and all that was derived out in the ocean, they bring it into the rivers. It's like tourism dollars. It's really important. It was really important to the smooth running of the river ecosystems, and with their decline, that really hurt the river. So when we bring back shad, we're helping to bring back a lot of other critters. And I'm going to change slides because I know there's a delay. I don't have the picture in front of me, so I kind of lose my train of thought. But it's let's let me know when you see a new slide that shows some historic pictures. I think they'll be coming up. Yeah, right now. Starting at the upper left are carvings in the rocks up at Great Falls. That's you can see the drawing up at just to the right of that at the top, the shad. So some early people carved that in the rocks at Great Falls many years ago. We don't know how long ago. Down below is an image carved in the rocks of shad from the coast of Spain. The similarities are interesting. I'll leave it there. That the native peoples had a variety of ways of harvesting fish. There's some pictures by E.S. Curtis up in the upper right over in California showing how they netted fish in California with a bow net, which is basically this Indian here is holding a long hooped net, two branches that make that, and then the woven net in between. Another one sitting on these rocks and doing similar. And they probably used gear like that on the Potomac, but again, the native peoples were gone from the Potomac, essentially gone from the Potomac long before we had photographs. Down below that are two gentlemen sitting at Great Falls about 1912. They were shad dippers. They would go up, people would go up to Great Falls and dip shad there. And on the over here on the left falls, 1801 was before the C&O Canal, by the way. So there are probably a lot more fish up there in 1801 than we see. I'm going to move to the next slide. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Native American methods of fishing. Again, Errol, I'm looking at you since I don't see Chris. I'm looking for your thumbs up when you see the slides of the Native Americans fishing. Don't see them yet. There is a long delay. I'm sorry for that. We are expecting thunderstorms here. We have a 70% chance over the next hour. I'm in near Harper's Ferry, by the way, is where I live. So there's probably a delay of time just due to location. Okay, thank you. So the Native Americans used to fish, and shad was an important fish for them. Over on the left, these drawings of their fishing. These are in the Chesapeake Bay, in the tidal portions of the rivers. They would use essentially the same equipment that's used nowadays, pound nets. Fish would come up and they'd go into these little impoundments in here and then be harvested. But in the free-flowing rivers, the Indians would use rock weirs. They construct rock weirs, a lot of times with wood in them. In fact, one of those earlier pictures I showed you, that Curtis photograph of a weir, there were rocks and sticks in that. So sometimes there were a few sticks, or sometimes there were a whole lot of sticks. And then down below this drawing of the weirs, this is a satellite image looking down at the Potomac River near Brunswick, Maryland, and you see a weir. You can see the remains of that weir still in the river. There are hundreds of those in the Potomac River, by the way. And they were fished actually until about the 1930s, not by Native Americans, but when the Indians left, usually the adjacent landowners took them over. It wasn't until 1936 that it became illegal to sell freshwater fishes the way we do now, and they didn't become game fishes. So people were still harvesting them and selling them. You had commercial fisheries even up in Harper's Ferry at that time. Next slide. So when you see this slide, you'll see an airplane at the top. Here, I'm going to that one. And I'm going to be showing you another fish weir on the Potomac. So let me see the thumbs up arrow when you see the, okay, good. Everybody sees. This is the Potomac River, just a little bit above Chain Bridge. Again, Cabin John's coming over to the left. The river flows the direction that the airplane is flying. This is a satellite image. I didn't take this from a balloon or anything. I got it from a satellite image. That white line is sort of the Virginia shoreline. This is Virginia up over to the upper right. And you can see the airplane for sort of scale. But what I wanted you to look at is down at the lower part of the picture. Can you all see my cursor all right? I'm following this V that you see down at the lower part of the river. Okay, that's a fish weir. That's a 900-foot long fish weir. But what's important, if you look at the very bottom, there's a weir that goes, the weir makes a Z kind of motion. There's an area at the bottom where the weir goes upstream. Basically, the pin, the nick point of the weirs are where they harvested the fish. So this weir right over here, the larger one you see on the right, that were harvested by the Indians were the American eels, the largest predatory fish in the native predatory fish in the Potomac River. But this weir over here is pointing upstream. And this is the area between Little Falls and Great Falls. So they were probably harvesting shad and herring and maybe rockfish and sturgeon even in this weir here. Somewhere near here was probably a village because it took a lot of work and time to do this. So they'd probably be more than likely a seasonal village, but the Native Americans were there fishing. And, you know, it's just kind of one of those forgotten things that we have these weirs in the river, but they were there. They're evidence of the old use. Now I've changed slides, and let me know when you see not only to the Native Americans, but also to the early colonists for food, but at their lowest. People are starving. I've seen that my internet connection is unstable. You hear me all right? Okay, good. People are starving. When the shad arrived, they were life-saving fish. They're very important to them. They were important to the economy of the early Americans. I'll get into that a little bit earlier, of the early European Americans. And in 1778, shad importantly saved the starving troops at Valley Forge. They didn't arrive up the Schuylkill River, though. They came by wagon. There's a good story called the Valley Forge Fish Story, if you want to learn more about that. I'm going to my next slide. What basically happened is the Valley Forge Congress, including George Washington, realized that the British held Philadelphia, where the Schuylkill River runs through, so they needed to get shad there, so they bought to feed the troops, because that was the source of food in the spring. So they brought them in by wagon from the Potomac. Flashbacks, you see that? Yeah, okay, good. This is a drawing, as you see, it's dated 1996, but it's showing one of the fisheries that was on the river in the 1800s, the Chapman fishery. It was things started getting large. That's going to be one of the themes here, is the fishing effort got bigger and bigger as technology improved. They were using big nets to haul in the fish. They were salting them down. In 1816, the Chapman's important because he kept good records of his fisheries. One of the few colonists anywhere in the East. His gross earnings in 1816 were $10,200. Okay, that's about $190,000 in today's money. That's one guy's, 2-month earnings. So you can see how important economically they were as well. I'm going to the next slide, which is going to show you pictures from a variety of areas on the Potomac where the shad was the biggest fishery in the Potomac, in the Chesapeake Bay until about the 1930s. It eclipsed the striped bass fishing, oyster, crabs, and all that. More shad were caught. There's more money in shad than any other thing. Do you see my new slide, Ariel? Good, thanks. Over on the upper left, you see a haul seine net, which was the principal gear that they used, men deploying that by hand. Over on the right, you all from the Anacostia might be familiar with this. Actually, I found this picture at the Library of Congress and shared it with the Anacostia folks years ago. But that shows, again, the Navy Yard in the back. You're on the Anacostia title, Anacostia there, Anacostia Park. Now, you see them using a horse-drawn, pulling up the nets with horse-drawn carriages. And down below that is a little shack that had a steam engine on it that would pull the net down off Mason Neck. And then over on the bottom left are the harvested fish that they're getting ready to process. And that's a picture on the Potomac. It's often miscited as being in other areas, but that's a Potomac picture. And I'm going to the next slide when you get it. Because one of the things I noticed about these slides of early fishing, and let me know when you see a boat and crew members on the shore, Ariel. I'll kind of look over for your, okay, good. You see a shad boat from the late 1800s. They were big boats. They had 24 oarsmen, 12 on each side. You see the oars there. And then that big empty space in the front was where they put the net. And you see the lantern box, because again, they didn't have electricity, but shad spawn in the evenings, they would often fish in the evenings. They needed to mark where they were so the other steam-powered boats, whatever, didn't run into them. I noticed early on is almost all the watermen in these old pictures are black. And then I'll go to the next slide pretty quickly here. In just a whole series of slides and pictures and images from that time period, you see that the watermen are black. I'm showing on my screen a picture by Thomas Eakins, a painting by Thomas Eakins up on the Delaware River. Do you see that? Yeah, good. You see the shad boats very similar to what was used on the Potomac, but again, the watermen are almost entirely black. It wasn't until about the late 1800s when that started to switch over where there were more white watermen. Almost all watermen from Delaware south were black, 99% of them until about the 1880s, 1890s. Whites felt that the fishing was a stinky, messy job and wasn't fit for white folks. That changed. But it's important black history here. And I'm going to go to my next slide because I just want to mention some of the roles that black watermen had. So let me see when you see a slide of 6 different, okay, good. So there are important things that the watermen did both before and during the Civil War, and even after the Civil War. The interplantation communication was really important. These shad fishermen were often either free blacks or they were, as in the words of one of them, they were as close to free as possible. They would be hired out and they'd travel up the rivers as the shad would move. And they would be a conduit of information to the different plantations, which really limited the information. So people could hear what their mom or their aunt or old friends, old family members were saying. They'd get some word about what's going on in the rest of the world from these watermen. They would fish at night and they were often left to themselves to fish for shad. And they'd use a lot of the plantation help to harvest the shad. So it was actually a fun time. It was supposedly the most fun time for the slaves of the year. The watermen also were fugitive slave conduits. If you're a slave in the South and you're heading north, you got many rivers to cross. You get to a river, you don't know how to swim. You were never taught to swim purposely. How do you get across a river? You look for a waterman. Again, until 1880, 99% of them were black. You're traveling at night, you call over to them, they come over at risk to themselves and they would bring you across the river. Very important to that. The watermen also became the U.S. Navy sailors. as they did in the Revolution and the Civil War. They became sailors. They're very important. They were important navigators because they knew the rivers in the South. They fished them. They worked them. They knew them very well. The Confederates really didn't know the rivers that well, the navigation in the rivers. So they were important to that. And also important, they were spies. They knew what was going on. They saw things that were going on. And they helped provide food to the contraband communities as these slaves were escaping and moving to these Union troops. They helped provide feed, and then after the Civil War, they helped to provide self-reliance. And I bring an example, Abraham Galloway pictured, who was born a slave. He escaped in 1857, went to Canada, became an abolitionist speaker, but he went back to North Carolina at great risk and became a spy master. The spy master is one who goes, he has lots of spies, he had lots of friends along the river in North Carolina, and he would go up disguised as a waterman and get information from them about what's going on, what are the Confederate troops doing. So he became an army organizer and recruiter. He met with Lincoln. He said Lincoln wanted the blacks to fight in the war, and Abraham Galloway, who was very important to that movement, said, if you want us to fight, if you want us to carry cartridge boxes, we want the ballot box. After the war, he became a U.S. Senator from North Carolina. He fought for the rights of blacks and women. One of the first people to really fight for the blacks and women. Unfortunately, he died at an early age. I just want to mention him because I think he's so neat. I do have a presentation on that that's available at the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River's website, potomacriver.org. And you can learn more about black watermen from that. That slide should come up shortly. I'm going to move to my next slide. So, Ariel, let me know when you see a slide that shows a big smokehouse. You probably are looking at the slide of where the presentation is located, and then that one should disappear shortly, and you'll see a big smokehouse. Okay, so this is just showing you some of the industry involved back into the preparation of shad. And in this picture from an old drawing, you'll see that on the bottom right, the shad come in, they're salted, they're put on racks. The racks are brought up into this big house. There's the smoke, there's smoke, then the racks are brought down, and they're then put in barrels with salt to preserve them, and then shipped away. In this picture here, just that one screen, there's about 1,500 fish in that smokehouse, right in that one level. I don't know how deep that oops, my slide just changed. I don't know how deep that building was, but you know, it didn't have, if it was just 30 feet long, they were smoking 45,000 shad at one time. So it was a big, what I'm getting at is the big business. This shad stuff was a big business. I've changed slides, so I'm going to talk about how remarkably abundant the Potomac River was for shad. Spencer Baird, who was the first director of the U.S. Fish Commission, created after the Civil War, said there's no better illustration of the numbers of migratory fish in the rivers than can be presented in the Potomac River, the short distance between its mouth and the Great Falls of Potomac, only 12 miles above Washington. He said that an estimated 22.5 million shad, that's 110 million pounds, were harvested from the Potomac in 1832. And they used approximately 1 million barrels, 195,000 barrels of salt to cure them. I'm thinking you're looking at my slide now of Spencer Baird. Is that correct? Ariel, give me a thumbs up. Good. Okay, that many barrels would make a pyramid the size of a football field using the end zones to a height of 300 feet. However, 1 barrel of salt can make 4 barrels of shad and herring. So you have to multiply that number by 4 to get the actual amount. And now my slide, I'm showing you a pyramid of barrels. Do you see that slide? Just to give you an idea of how many barrels that would be. Okay, this is a picture from the 1950s, a bad era for barrels, when up in Maine, Salem, Maine, or Massachusetts, they were getting ready to burn this pile of barrels for a 4th of July celebration, this big pile of barrels. Well, if you look, if you were to put the stack of smoked shad, barreled shad next to that thing, it would be 15 times taller, 20 times wider, and 60 times longer than that stack of barrels that you see there. And I'm illustrating this because that huge amount of barrels meant a lot of secondary economy. The barrel makers, the woodmen, the carpenters, the blacksmiths, the coopers, colliers, wagon masters, teamsters, horses, mules, blah, 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 went on and on. So the shad was huge in the economy. And according to annual reports of the C&O Canal, the shad and herring, barrels of shad and herring were the #1 item by dollar value moving up the C&O Canal over its lifetime. Now I'm showing a picture of shad plankings up at, it's near Marshall Hall. It's actually downriver from you all, about 10 miles down from DC. Do you see that slide, Ariel? And there's actually showing the planking at Marshall Hall with a guy tipping his hat up at the upper area there. Now planking is a way of fixing cleaved shad to planks and baking them. It's not smoking them, it's baking the shad. And to show how popular they were, these pictures of the DC bar, these are the DC bar. You can read kind of the bottom one. It's May 17th, I've forgotten the year on that. You look up 24 down at Marshall Hall. This is the DC bar, very diverse group at the time, you know. But look at all, you know, you don't get a bunch of lawyers to come down and eat shad if they don't taste good. Shad are very delicious. Their scientific name, Melosa sapidisma. Melosa means they're a herring. Sapidisma, sapid part of it means they're savory or delicious. You know, your scientific name is delicious. It's kind of rough on you. Going to my next slide. While I'm talking, another critter in the bay that has a similar name is the blue crab, Calanectes sapidus. Calanectes means it's a swimming crab. Sapidus is the delicious swimming crab. Again, we're kind of rough on the critters that we call their species name is delicious. So now I've got a slide showing a big net on the river. Do you see that, Ariel? Do you see it? Good. Okay, this is a picture of a haul seine off of Mason Neck that the length of the net was 22,000. Well, the net's 9,600 feet in length, and it's the ropes that bind it were 22,000. That makes it a 6-mile long net that they swept out in the ocean to collect shad. So you see the technology is really getting big, and they'd collect many, many shad at one time. That closed down in 1910, and because the shad numbers started to decline. And I'm showing this, I'm looking at a slide that will come to you shortly of the records, the historical catch data along the Potomac. Do you see that now, Ariel? Do you see the graph? But it's, you know, look at this one real quickly. It's put together by the Potomac River Fisheries Commission, and it shows this decline in shad numbers from the late 1800s down to when they closed the shad fishery in Maryland and much of the East Coast. And Maryland was closed in 1980, and on the Potomac in 1982. Because that's run by state. So you see there's a big decline, but the decline in the shad wasn't just over harvesting. That was certainly a significant factor in it. The technology grew and we started over harvesting. Overfishing was one, but also pollution. I think on the Potomac that was particularly bad. The pollution in the Potomac would pretty much kill anything that came up to try to spawn in the spring. And the third major factor was the loss of spawning habitat. And mainly that was done by the building of dams, which started in the early 1800s with the building of the canals, the era of canals. They needed water to put in the canals of fishes, and that really started lowering the numbers, even started in the early 1800s on the Potomac. That started in 1823. So they lost the habitat, but again, the real big one is the pollution in our case for the Potomac, because there was the dissolved oxygen in the Potomac and in the Anacostia in the probably by the 40s or 50s went down to zero. And as these fish came up, the shad, the striped bass, and other fish just died in mass. It became a stinking mess, international embarrassment for us, and President Lyndon Johnson declared the Potomac a national disgrace. even at Mount Vernon, signs put up on the river, saying it's, the river's polluted. Georgia's out of a shape, would be so sad. Fortunately, that's not the case anymore. That sign's removed, and people are again enjoying the river down there. And now I'm showing a slide of the dams up at just above Little Falls. Good. There's actually a collection. There's actually 3 dams. The first dam is one that went from this little island in the middle called Snake Island and went down. It's a feeder canal that the Potomac Company for George Washington built because they didn't have a canal going the whole stretch of the river with George's Potomac Company. It was skirting canals at Great Falls, at Little Falls, and at Harper's Ferry. There were a skirting canal. The rest of the river, they used the run of the river. And then in the 1820s, the C&O Canal incorporated that river, and they built a dam all the way across the river and blocked fish migration to some extent. And then when we had droughts in the 1960s and the Potomac, in this section above, in the area between Washington, D.C. and Great Falls pretty much dried up because we drank the river dry. So we built a dam down just above Little Falls called the Brookmont Dam, which you see is a long straight line. And it goes over to this big pump station that pumps it over the canal up to Delacarlia when there's droughts. So the river's allowed to flow, a bit of water is allowed to flow and then pumped up and only gets really dry down below that dam, which in that lower insert to the bottom left is a picture that I took of the drought. And you see you'll see the dams in the little background there. There's Snake Island in the middle. But what's important about this picture and what I felt revealed very well, this is the 2000 era drought period. And it showed the canal, the natural channel of the Potomac is actually over on the Virginia side over there on the left. And that's where the fishway needed to be built and put. So we worked, starting in the early 90s, started working in an effort to get a fishway at the dams at Little Falls. It took a good while. It wasn't until 2000 before that finally came to fruition. In the winter of 2000, they were building the dams. I worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service and to design this fishway. You see, it's not the Hoover Dam. It's not a big dam. It's only about a 10-foot fall from the top to the bottom. But none of the migratory fish on the East Coast, except for the Atlantic salmon up in the Northeast, jump over anything. All the fish in the Chesapeake Bay that migrate don't jump over anything. They won't go over the tiny concrete blocks, whatever. You have to build what they call a fish way, not a fish ladder, a fish way where the fish can swim through it. And we designed one with these W-shaped weirs to slow the water down because you cut a notch and the water's going to flow fast through that notch. But these W-shaped weirs, there's 3 of them that slow the water down. This fishway is designed not for shad alone, it's for shad, for striped bass, and all the resident fishes that use this part of the river as well to give them access up and down the river. So that was the big change. Here's I'm going to show you real quickly an artist's drawing of the fishway. I'll go ahead and change that slide for me. You'll see it quickly. That fishway became the cover image for fish passage technology by again, it was Fish and Wildlife Service. It became incorporated into the other parts of the Department of Interior. But providing fish passage alone isn't enough. You can build a fishway, but the fish haven't been able to get up there. You've got to imprint the young to the water chemistry up above that fishway. So starting in 1995, I was tasked with, at my will, I wanted it done, to start a stocking program in the Potomac. We worked with Harrison Lake National Fish Hatchery, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Fish Hatchery, important partners. But again, stocking the fish isn't enough. Where am I going to go? What do I know? I knew enough to go to experts of catching shad. I went to Watermen. Again, the fishery was closed in 1982. But I went to a waterman that I knew, Lewis Harley, and talked to him. I said, would you be able to help me out here? You know, here's the idea. We're going out and going to net these shad and get the eggs, take the eggs to the hatchery, and then stock them in the Potomac. He said, yes, I will. Is there a picture of Lewis Harley showing now? Do you have a picture of, okay, good. And I worked with Lewis from 1995 until 2008 was the last year we worked together. He passed away from cancer in 2009. I continue to work with his sons, Brad and Mike. Sorry, I always have a tough time at that, but he's a good friend of mine. And I like working with Brad and Mike as well. But it wasn't just the Watermen and myself. I couldn't do it myself. A lot of volunteers, Sandy Burk included, and many others came out and helped. We owe a great debt of gratitude to all the volunteers that came out. And many of the nights were damp and chilly. Yeah, you start working with them in April or mid-April, early April, when it's still cold. River's still cold. Nights are cold. Really appreciate their help. Shad spawn in the evening, as I mentioned earlier. So we collect the fish, and then we strip the eggs out of the shad into mixing bowls, basically, and then the milk, the sperm, is added to those egg masses, and they're fertilized and left to river harden. And then we take them to the fish hatch. Well, I take them to Fredericksburg. I have to drive the eggs. I had big boxes loaded in my truck with the eggs, and we drive them to Fredericksburg, where the Fish and Wildlife Service personnel would meet me. They take them to the hatchery, which I think you're seeing now, which shows Dave Peterson loading freshly delivered eggs into the little container at the top of those tanks, where the eggs float for about a week until they hatch. And then they go into those they swim out of those little tanks and go into that large tanks. I'm showing you when we talk about the educational program, basically we worked with Dave. Dave was the main guy, but he helped to design a miniature version of this. He's putting a couple 100,000 eggs into each one of those tanks. With classrooms that we'll talk about don't have that size of can't handle that. And the other thing they do is, you notice these large tanks are on pallets. After the shad hatch and the fry are a few days old and they're tagged with a chemical, they are then picked up. That big tank is just picked up by those pallets and loaded onto a flatbed truck. And then that flatbed truck would leave the Harrison Lake National Fish Hatchery, which is down near Hopewell, Virginia on the James River. And they would travel up and stock the fry at Mather Gorge on the Virginia side. There's a emergency boat ramp, rescue boat ramp, that we would have to carefully back that truck down and then stock the fry into the Potomac River at Mather Gorge. Now, we stocked the fry from 1995, and we concluded our stocking successfully in 2002. The numbers of adult shad returning were looking good, and we finished the restoration stocking. But starting in 2003, the Potomac became the egg source for lots of other rivers in the Chesapeake Bay. We went from hardly having any shad in the Potomac to where we had so many that we're able to provide eggs to other rivers. And we started working with I started working with and the Interstate Commission on the Potomac with the Virginia Game and Inland Fisheries folks to collect shad for stocking in the Rappahannock. Maryland was out on the river collecting shad and shad eggs for their rivers, and the Fish and Wildlife was out on the river collecting shad for the Susquehanna. Continued until this year, when things were curtailed for the coronavirus. First stocking in the river, we wanted people involved to learn about this fish again. We had a classroom come down and witness Sandy Geddes' class excuse me, I'm forgetting the name. I'll remember in a second. Came down to see the stocking. Westbrook Elementary, sorry, just completely slipped my mind. Westbrook Elementary, which still helps stock shad, 25 years later. I have 22 birthday. This is an older slide. It's 25 years now that they've been helping out. And not only with the restoration of the shad, but also with this, when these other entities are coming down for these other rivers, they're taking and killing shad for these other rivers. Well, we have a replacement stocking. Everybody that takes shad from the Potomac for these other rivers has to replace 10% of their fry back into the river to replace the adults that were sacrificed. And the students were helping with that as well, starting in 2003. We had a lot of schools involved in the project. At one time, we had 54 schools spread over the Washington metropolitan area, all the way as far west as Poolesville. They had 84 systems, 53 schools, 84 systems, because some schools, like all the fifth graders, every 4 fifth grade classrooms would have a tank, and each one had it. So we had multiple tanks and a lot of enterprise at that point. So we did a lot of this work. We stocked the shad. How are they doing in the Potomac? What's happening to the Potomac shad population? Is it doing well? Is it doing badly? Well, fortunately, all the evidence is it's doing well. Starting early on, we worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service and personnel there. Mike Odom is going to be pictured. You'll see that soon, I think, of Mike holding a shad that netted up to Great Falls. We sampled there for 3 years, finding ever increasing numbers. And the best way we found to sample, we tried a variety of ways: electrofishing, gill netting, doing things, the dip nets. That's the shad rock that I showed you earlier, where those guys were fishing. We're back on shad rock, fishing the same place. But we had to conclude that due to budgetary cutbacks that the Fish and Wildlife Service had. And we haven't been able to get back up there and look, but people coming to Great Falls notice the shad, notice the fish eating the shad. In fact, on the Virginia side, there's a little information kiosk at the overlook showing that, hey, what you're seeing down there, the life under the surface, are these returning fish coming back to spawn. So that's good news. The adults are coming back in good numbers. The young of the year, you'll soon be seeing a slide, a graph showing the number of young shad captured in the Maryland Department of Natural Resources annual baywide shore haul seine. They have sites on the Potomac that they've been monitoring since 1959. And you'll see, is that showing up now, Ariel? Do you see the graphic of the young of year shad? Good. Well, you see, when I started in 1995, stocking program initiated, the numbers were really low. The shad fishery was closed in 1982. And you look back at the record before that, those were the good years. When I started, those were the big years on the right-hand side of the graph. But, you know, pretty quickly by 2000, we were eclipsing the old records. And now for the last 17 of the last 20 years, we've eclipsed the highest year, 1972, of those previous records. And it continues to grow. You can't see, I can't see, maybe you all can see the far left-hand side, but we've had really good years, and they're, you know, the young of the year are doing well. Similarly, the adult shad are coming back. There's a Maryland program they started in how many striped bass are coming in their nets. They're also counting other fish that they collect in their nets, and the adult American shad in their nets have also been increasing. Do you see that slide? I don't want to go. It's got, okay, good. That's again data from the Maryland, the Maryland gill net survey for rockfish. But fortunately, again, and this is one of my favorite of the studies. They use multi-mesh nets. When we're catching shad, we're basically just catching the large adult females and with equal amount of males. But this is a more fishery independent survey that I consider more important than our work. And then the commercial harvest that's recorded down at the Potomac River Fisheries Commission is also, they had a restoration target they set back in the early 1980s when the numbers are really low. They set the restoration target, which is going to be a graph. You'll see it's a blue line running near the bottom of that restoration target of 31.1 pounds of shad per net was the restoration target. And that's an average, it's a running average. And we've exceeded that now for a number of years. In fact, again, by the law on who regulates the fisheries in the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, and they use that threshold number, that 31.1 number, and the Potomac's again met that. We reopened the commercial fishery a little bit, just that they're only taking a couple of bushels of shad a day, not big amounts. So now in the springtime, when you go to the store, you can be buying Potomac harvested shad at the store. I'm glad about that. I support that. And I also support a return to the recreational fishery, which is growing. up at Fletcher's Boathouse especially. A lot of those are DC residents, but Maryland and people from all over the world even come to Washington, DC to fish for shad in the springtime. It's making news on the Potomac. And again, I'm glad people are able to enjoy this fish, and I hope the recreational harvest so people can enjoy them. A plank shad or a smoked shad are really delicious fish. They're still harvested. We have plankings throughout the watershed. It's not the end of the story though. The shad, Potomac's doing well, but most of the rivers, sadly, most of the rivers on the East Coast are not doing well. And again, when the shad are out in the ocean and they're the only ones that are doing well, the other populations are really at all-time historic lows. So all these different things that eat them, they're preying heavily on the Potomac shad. So we won't see a real recovery of the Potomac until all of the rivers on the East Coast are full. I'm going to turn it over to Sandy shortly because I want her to talk about the students' efforts. They're so important, so rewarding, both for the number of shad, but also emotionally for me, for everybody involved, and the students especially. Sandy's got a great book about it she'll talk about, and I'll go real quickly. I mentioned awards, and I'm going to end up with a slide showing one of my favorite recognitions of shad, which is in the Anacostia up at Melrose Skate Park. Does anybody, I hope people are familiar with that picture, kind of a Japanese take on shad. Shad don't really jump this way, but it's nice that people are recognizing the shad again. And the American shad is now the official state fish of DC, and I'm happy about that. And I'll end my talk right there. There's some lessons learned. Restoration works, stocking does work, public involvement is very important. Fish passage you do in increments. The aquatic vegetation is very important, and you got to have patience. Again, I started doing this in the 80s, and so it took a while to have that. So like old lodgkins, you got to have patience. Endeavor to persevere. And that's from the movie Little Big Man. Thanks for having me. I look forward to seeing you all perhaps on the river. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back. I don't know how I did on time. I have no idea. Oh, well, an hour. Well, I didn't start. I had 40 minutes.
Started a little late.
It was the lag delay brought you down, buddy.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you for your patience too.
It was great, Jim.
Thank you, Jim. We do have some questions, which we'll get to in a minute, but let's first turn it over to Sandy to talk a little bit about her book and the efforts of the students, and then we'll have Chris talk about that a little bit as well too.
I'm drinking the root beer.
That's right. All right, let's see, Sandy. So if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
I will mute myself too when you want to speak.
Okay, great.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. All right. Yes. Thank you, Sandy. Go ahead.
All right. I have been working with Jim on this project for 20 years. We started in 1995, and at that time I started writing down everything that was going on with the project, and it ended up being a little book. The book is called Let the River Run Silver Again. It follows one school, Westbrook Elementary, for many years of their Raise and Release project. It follows two students, Nick and Julia, and they worked with Jim in the very beginning in 1996 to get fish eggs and raise them in their school. And then the school released them up at Great Falls at above Little Falls Dam. So the book follows these students through their journey of raising and releasing American shad on the Potomac River. That's all I have.
I'm unmuting myself just to let you know it's raining where I live right now, so I might lose connectivity. So just FYI, if you don't see me, it's because the internet's gone.
Oh, I wanted to add that you can order the book on Amazon.com, and it's $14.95 for a copy. And it covers the whole Shad project and this one school and how they've been raising and releasing American Shad for 25 years.
Awesome. Thank you, Sandy. Yeah, it's a fantastic book, and we, include that for the schools that we work with now, currently on the Shad project. So, Chris, if you want to talk a little bit about where we are now with the Shad project, and then we can get to the questions.
Yeah, sure. Can I do a little share screen here? Will that
Yeah,
work?
go for it.
Nope, it's not letting me. 1 second. Oops. All this technology is really great.
That's right.
All right, cool. I got it.
There we go. All right, there we go. Perfect.
Okay, let's see if I can make this full screen. Maybe. No, not letting me. Okay. So you see it says, what do we do to help? You see that?
Yeah.
Good. All right, cool. Yeah, so this is sort of, I'll just kind of do a quick and dirty update on what the program looks like, sort of the boots on the ground level at AWS. And so what we're doing is we are going out and we are collecting the fish in the same way that Jim and Sandy have been collecting the fish for years. And what we do is we bring them we engage DC area classrooms with this. At the peak of the project, there were probably more than 70 classes, or 70 schools, I'll say, that participated. Now we're in the sort of the low to mid 30 range. It kind of fluctuates year to year. But to kind of give you an idea about what the schools are engaged with, as you can see on this picture here, you can see down here is the original hatchery, right? And so this was designed down to fit into a classroom. So it's the exact same concept, right, of having a couple reservoirs, a water filter in there, and you see where the eggs are being poured into this chamber. Right in the top, there is a miniaturized egg chamber. So it's the same hatchery system that the pros use. It's just instead of being hundreds of gallons of water, we're at about 50 gallons of water per hatchery system. But this is something that we provide to our participating schools so that the kids can see these little baby shads, have them in their classroom, work with them, collect data on them, and all kinds of good science. And so what we do is just like kind of what you saw, a lot of what Jim was sharing, is that we're doing the same serious boots on the ground, real deal science. We're heading out with the Watermen down in Virginia, still working with the Harleys, heading out there with all of our gear, sending out gill nets that hang like curtains in the water. We're not using these big seine nets like the colonists were using. So we're putting maybe a couple 100 feet of net out into the river. And watching those nets, taking good care of them. And then hopefully if we did a good job and we got a little bit lucky, when we pull in those nets, they will be full of American shad and hopefully not too much other bycatch. But you can see this is Brad picking the nets, getting some shad out. They go into a live well here that we keep them while they are, while they're waiting to be processed to get to get their eggs. And then we extract the eggs. And so you can see, right, this is probably Jim. I'm guessing that these are Jim's hands in these pictures, is my guess. Squeezing the eggs out of a female fish, right? We get the milt or sperm from the male eggs, fertilize them as they start to, when they first come out, it looks a lot like applesauce, which is always a fun thing I love sharing with the kids. I get a lot of good reaction from that. And then once they start, once the fertilization process is going on and we put them in a special custom-made container by Jim that goes in the Potomac so they can plump up with river water. They become these perfect little spherical gems. And then we sit, this is usually done in the evening, so you can see that it gets darker and darker. So by nighttime, we are back at shore with all of the eggs that we've harvested, bagging them up. We bag them up in aquarium bags, just the same thing you would get if you got yourself a beta fish at PetSmart. It would come in the same bag, and we load them up with river water, the eggs, and some oxygen. You can see this is one of my favorite pictures of me ever because it looks like I'm in charge here, and I'm definitely not. I'm doing what I'm told. And then early the next morning, the teachers come up, meet myself or one of our, staff members or part of our crew to come pick up their bag of eggs. And then they take them to the classroom, put them in their hatchery system with the big red bucket on top that you saw in the first picture. When the students get the eggs, when the classes get the eggs, they just look like those little round pearls. After a couple days, you can see, because the eggs are clear, you can see those eggs starting to develop, what's going on inside them. So if you look over here, this is a picture from years ago, taken off of an old tube TV, but you can see that there's the yolk attached to what is not quite a fish yet, but is definitely more than just an egg, right? So you can see the fish is developing, its eyes developing, its body, right, as it consumes the nutrition from that yolk. And over here, this is just to give you an idea, right? These eggs are teeny tiny, about the size of a BB, if you're familiar with a BB. And you can see when they hatch, right, they're absolutely these teeny tiny little thing, right? If you didn't know any different, you might think it was like a mosquito larva or something. But you can see the tiny little squiggle right here, right? The two black dots for eyes and an almost invisible body, right? But they're teeny tiny when they're hatching. And so the kids get them as eggs. By the end of the week, they have. So by the end of the week, they have they've gone from an egg to a little hatched fish. Now this came from a PowerPoint, so this was meant to be a little looped video. Which when we go to put this presentation up on our webpage, I will make sure to include a short, about 5-second long video. But this is what the kids are seeing in their classroom, right? And so all these little things there are developing fish in there. So you can see the yolks. And all these little dots you see are the smaller dots are their developing eyes. And as the kids are watching them, I mean, they're literally twitching back and forth inside the egg by Wednesday into Thursday of Shad Week. And then by Thursday into Friday, all of their baby fish have hatched. And the teacher collects them into a bucket for transport out on their field trip. They get out to the Anacostia River. We release at a couple different sites. This is right at the confluence. This is from a couple years ago. So this release happened actually at the old port of Bladensburg. This one over here on the left, these are students from Prince George's County, Maryland, and they're releasing at Bladensburg Waterfront Park. But we also have a major release for the DC schools, which happens, and we do actually do several of these down at Anacostia Park. So yeah, and just as a little added bonus, when we have the kids out there doing all this great work in science and restoration, we make sure we have as much fun with them too. And so part of their deal is we get them on one of our boats out on the Anacostia so they can enjoy sort of the fruits of their labor, see what the river's all about. Know there's more. I mean, it's all about the shad, but know that there's more out there than just the shad. So they get to see the osprey and the bald eagles and, lots of turtles up and down the river. So yeah, so there you go. So that's sort of the, like what we do, obviously, for the May, just ended my screen share there, for the May into June. No, I'm sorry. So this project, right? So the fish are running in April into May is when they're really hitting it. So we do all this right at the end of April, the last week of April, the first week of May is typically our sweet spot for the project. And obviously this year it was not safe and feasible to pull it off. And in fact, I don't know of anybody who was, even the government hatcheries, it sounds like nobody was able to get out and get any shad this year. So a little pause this year, but we're looking to pick it up next year and do kind of more of the same. So, all right, so there you go. So I'm done with my piece. We can get to some questions. And so I'm going to kick it off here. I don't know if any questions popped up when I was just blabbing on. But Jim, there were a couple questions that I jotted down here. And so the first two questions I had to do with the fishing, the weirs. And the questions are if those weirs impact the shad run at all. And also, are we able to see those weirs from standing on the side of the river, yeah, there you go.
All right, so I'm assuming that the weirs are talking about are the fishway weirs.
Yeah.
They are visible from the shoreline, but that's the Virginia shoreline, which is privately owned and very well guarded. That's some of the most expensive real estate in the United States. There's actually armed guards on some of those properties. So I've been over there and observing from the Virginia shore. It's only about 30 feet from the Virginia shore, and you can see the weirs, see the water churning in the weirs. The last time the only time you could really see the weirs good was like when that picture was taken when they were building the fish.
Yeah.
They had blocked it off, and you could see it. But those Indian weirs, again, you can see the Indian weirs that I talked about are visible in low and clear water times on the Potomac in a variety of places. They're up and down the Potomac and the Shenandoah and other rivers. There are a lot of people fishing, not just for shad again, but when I mentioned Shenandoah, the shad never got up to the Shenandoah, but there are a lot of people fishing in the area. Hope that answers that question all right.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, you nailed it. So the other question that I had, let me make sure I've got this. Is there restoration going on for any other species of shad? I didn't know of any.
Well, there's some restoration efforts going on for other species of herring, again, which the shad is the American shad is the world's largest herring. So river herring, the hickory shad, there's no restoration efforts for them. They've never been that commercially important. There's not a lot of money behind it driving that one. But they're starting to come back too. We're glad to see on the Potomac. A river herring, I'm glad to report, are starting to make a little bit of a resurgence. Oh, I forgot to mention I've been joined by my wife, Nancy. She's question and answer period. But to my knowledge, no other shad restoration. And unfortunately, with the budgetary cutbacks and this COVID, it's not just the Potomac that's had a cutback. It's up and down the East Coast. So I hate seeing that, both budgetarily and the pandemically constricted efforts right now.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I'm going to answer a quick question. I'm going to bounce it back over to you, Jim. So the question that I'm fielding here is the Anacostia River close to its shad conservation goal? And I will just say this, that we don't have a specific metric that we are trying to achieve within the Anacostia River. We are looking at trying to make a swimmable and fishable Anacostia, and that and we attack that with a lot of different projects. What I will say, and if you didn't catch this earlier, I'm the manager of the education department at AWS, and so I will just say this: that to me, as much as this project is about restoring American shad populations, it's also a lot about having kids restore American shad populations, if that makes sense. So as far as like the project and looking at it as a conservation goal, and I know, Jim, you can probably speak more towards the goals on the Potomac and the whole eastern seaboard, but there's not a specific metric that we are trying to hit as far as number of shad in the Anacostia, but I will say my goal is to have every student in DC have some experience with shad eggs that they raise in their classroom. So that's my piece with that. So Jim, what would you say about shad conservation goals and where we're at?
Let me just develop that a little bit.
Please.
You're right. I know of no goals for the Anacostia, but also the shad are a main stem river spawner. And the Anacostia, they only basically go to right about the confluence, just above Ladensburg, at the confluence of the northeast and northwest branches. And I've worked for years, by the way, on fish passage in many of the tributaries of the Anacostia. Started the very first evaluation in the 1980s of the fisheries of the Anacostia. And herring are important there. And we have fish passage efforts up and down the Anacostia streams for river herring. And we stocked river herring in the Anacostia for a number of years as well. And they're starting to show a comeback. So we're glad to report that. But shad are harder. And yeah, I think for the Anacostia, you just want to see them back in good numbers in the Anacostia, where you see them typically in the spring. And again, I hope people will be fishing for them again on the Anacostia.
Yeah. So Jim, I
want to add a little bit again. I've been working with Chris for a number of years now. We had other organizations early on, living classrooms for a number of years, but Chris and the Anacostia Watershed Society have been helping out a long time. Even when we have these other organizations, Anacostia Watershed Society was always one of them pitching in. And Chris has really stepped up to the plate. We wouldn't even be having this for the last 5 years or so if it wasn't for Chris and the Anacostia Watershed Society. So I wanted to get that thank you to you, Chris, and to the Anacostia Watershed Society before we finish our chats here.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that, Jim. Yeah, no, I mean, I would just say, to speak for myself, it's one of the things I'm most proudest of, doing the work that I do. I felt like the time was right for AWS for AWS to grab onto this with both hands, and it's worked out really, really well for a lot of people and a lot of fish.
Hey, Chris.
Yes, Sandy.
Somebody had a question about the tetracycline marking of the shad.
Yep.
And in my book, I have a whole thing on how they do that and why they do that. And originally, when the fish were raised and released above Great Falls, at Great Falls, they were marked with tetracycline. And so that's how we knew that they were using the fish ladder, the fish way, was that they had recaptured a fish above Little Falls Dam at Great Falls that had the marking on its ear bone.
It's not an ear bone.
Otolith.
The bone in their skull that's used for hearing.
Technicality.
Do you? Yeah, no. It is the tetracycline tagging is. I mean, it's very cool. It's some very, very cool science. Jim, do you want to do a little deeper dive into what that is?
I'll talk a little bit of a deep dive here on the school issue. With when we first started getting the schools involved, all of the stock shad were supposed to be marked, and we had to, at the very first couple of years, we didn't actually bring eggs to the schools. We brought marked fry from the hatchery to the schools, and they kept them in the schools and fed them brine shrimp for a week or so and then released them. And that was very unsatisfactory. And I worked with the marking task force to say, give us an exception. We want these kids involved. They can't use tetracycline in a classroom setting. So they gave us the permission to not have to mark the school shad are not marked fish. But that way the kids get to see the eggs hatch, which is the exciting and important part. And also, we've had, this is probably the school participation is probably best at 4th or 5th grade, but we have kindergartners, and Sidwell Friends has been doing it from the first year as well. And they are senior, 10th, 11th, 12th graders that look at the developmental biology going on day to day, what organs, what tissues are coming out. So, the young kids and kindergartners just go, they scream when the eggs hatch. 4th and 5th graders do a little bit more work, but it lends itself to a lot of stuff. And the teachers love it. The kids, you don't have to ask them to do math. You don't have to ask them to do history. They want to learn about all this stuff. It's really a great tool. It's the feedback we get from the teachers. You know that, Chris. They like the project. That's why we still have 30 some schools doing it after 20 some years.
Yep.
So that they know it's a fun project that engages the students. And for every student engaged, their parents engaged, and their brothers and sisters, their younger siblings. I want to raise them. My brother did the shad. I want to do that. My older sister did it. So it's got a lot of multiplier effect to it. So I'm really pleased with it. I'm glad we're still doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I've seen there's a couple other things in the chat. I know, just so everyone's aware, right? I see that somebody from AWS has posted up a link to our Learning at Home page, which has a lot of our shad and shad related curriculum on it. So I highly recommend checking that out. One of the questions is it possible to see the shad? And yes, without being an expert fisherman or actively trying to catch them. They are moving up the river in spring, right? From usually April and May, and we've had times where up on the Anacostia where there are sort of bottlenecks, right? Where there are like little fishways that they have to get through, where you can see them. We had a couple people on our staff maybe a couple years ago take GoPro cameras and get some footage of them swimming by. So you can see them, or you can see them as they come up close to the shore when they're really starting to move up in numbers. So yeah, you can definitely see them. And I've gotten some really good feedback about the Black Watermen. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that we can, you know, that I know Grace had mentioned something about maybe doing like some online curriculum for that. I think that that's a great idea. And it certainly is engaging. I think it's all engaging, but it's a particularly engaging piece of the story here. Absolutely.
Yeah, and the Potomac watermen especially, because it was sort of the last river you had to cross to get over into the Union or whatever, get over to free land. Pennsylvania was really more free, but you know, it's close by. So the watermen and the Potomac, but I haven't found much history on that with the Potomac. There's more in North Carolina and further south, but I think that has to do with up on the Potomac, you better keep it secret what you're doing. Again, it's very dangerous. And even after the war, probably people were afraid to talk about what they did because they could have had retribution about how they helped. And so I think they kept quiet, and then sort of generationally it got lost. So anybody that has any information, old grandmom, grandpa, father that might have stories, I'd love to hear. And it would add to there's a number of, again, you look at my talk, there's a number of resources on that talk that I mentioned. It's online, my presentation's online. And I've got resources in that, books to read and people to contact if you do have any information on that, beyond me. I'm not the expert on that. I just noticed, hey, look at all the Black watermen in these pictures. And then it was revealed to me, it's one of the many facets of shad restoration that I've just found fascinating.
Let's see what else we got there. Jim, do you know? So there's a question about so there were some gizzard shad that were found in some of the smaller tributaries of the Anacostia. Do you have a sense of how common gizzard shad or hickory shad are in the area?
Well, the gizzard shad are related to American shad. They're not really shad. They're in that Dorsoma group of fishes. That's a family of fishes closely related. They're resident in the Anacostia and the Potomac year round. They don't go out to sea. And they're very abundant at one time because they're more pollution tolerant than the other fishes. At one time, they were really dominating the river in numbers when the river was in worse condition. As the river improved, I mean, they evolved in a clean river. They like clean rivers too, but they can handle, tougher conditions. But as the rivers improve, their numbers have kind of gone down a little bit. There's still a lot of them out there, and they do go up. They go up the streams to spawn with the herring. You mentioned numbers of shad, and there was a time in Sandy's book is entitled "Let the River Run Silver Again," because at one time there were so many shad in the river they turned the river silver. In the Susquehanna River, they'd actually create a wave moving upstream. The wave would push upstream. So many fish were coming in, they'd make not just a little ripple. I mean, a wave was witnessed by people as the fish arrived. And I'm very happy to report that just before my retirement in 2016, I worked at the Interstate Commission in Rockville. I got a call from somebody that had been on the Parkway in Great Falls looking down at Fletcher's Boathouse. And they said, "Why is the river so silver? I see it flashing silver down there." So I got a report of the river turning silver from some stranger that had no idea that's what I was looking for. So that was a real rewarding moment for me.
All right. I don't see any more outstanding questions here. I don't know if anybody's got a quick question they want to type into the chat. I don't know, Ariel, I can toss the facilitation back over to you. I kind of just steamrolled you there.
No, that's good. That's good. Yeah, feel free if you have another question in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question you want to ask verbally. You can go ahead and do that now.
Ariel, I can't recall. Is there a link to Shad Run on the Learning from Home page?
Yes, there is. I can also put it in the chat here.
That's a great video. Yeah, good point.
Yeah. So for those of you that don't know, Shad Run is about a half-hour, 40-minute documentary about the shad and the Shad Project, and everything that you've been hearing about tonight. It's really, really great. You'll see some familiar faces in that video, and a lot of graphics to show to demonstrate some of the points that that we've covered.
It's talking about shad on the Potomac,
Yeah.
the shad restoration effort and the kids' involvement in the Potomac. It's a great, I really like that video.
Jim, it looks like there's one more question about, now that the shad have rebounded from overfishing, what are the primary threats now to the shad?
Well, for the Potomac, again, that's water quality. We always have to be cognizant of that, but that's generally staying about the same. Maybe we've seen some decline in water quality, but I don't think it's enough to hurt the shad. But water quality is important. We have the fish weigh, so our habitat's okay. We've got the overharvest, but again, now that the shad are, when the shad are, adult shad are out in the ocean and there's no other shad from these, it used to be huge populations from these other rivers, but now you just basically have shad, a few, I'm not saying they're the only shad in the coast, but they're making up a disproportionate share that they didn't used to have. And so they're being heavily preyed upon. And I'm glad they're food sources again for these critters, but it's going to impact their recovery until we have shad populations in other rivers are better recovered as well. So that's the biggest obstacle to shad restoration in the Potomac is shad restoration in other rivers. Get that done.
Another question was that in one of your slides, it showed a big spike in the population in 2015. And if you had any thoughts on why that was such a good year.
Yeah, if you get different year spikes, some of that is just the relic of the monitoring. That's why it's not good to look at any given year. Now, those are young of the year numbers that I think they're talking about. We had some big spikes. The adult returning numbers kind of spike around, but the shad is a multi-year class set of fisheries. That means that there's shads of a variety of age. The males start coming back at 3 years old, the females come back at 4 or 5, and they live to about 12 to maybe 15 years. So, and they're repeat spawners in the Potomac. They come back repeatedly. That doesn't happen in Florida, for instance. They only spawn one time and they die. From the Potomac north, they have multi-year spawners. So when they come back as a multi-year, you'd think you'd see more of an even thing. Now, my feeling on why there's spikes in the numbers of adult returning is related to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, where the adult fish are coming by. If we have a really warm ocean, Atlantic Ocean, and that's happening with global warming, then the water temperature that they're living in might sweep up more rapidly or earlier past the Chesapeake Bay than the Chesapeake Bay origin shad, and some of them don't go back up to spawn, is my theory on this. And they stay in the ocean and resorb what little, because most of the egg development occurs as they're heading up the bay and up the river. But they just, I think we get some variation due to climatic issues that are going on.
There was another question about what kind of shad do you think were potentially in the Washington Channel this spring? People saw some shad there. Were they American shad, do you think, or were they getting the shad?
Quite likely. Now, the American shad tend to be a little bit deeper. They like to be about 8 or 10 feet down in the water column. Hickory shad, their close cousins, hickory shad, tend to be more on the surface. And then hickory shad will jump more. So a lot of people will see shad, and river herring will jump as well, flittering around. The American shad aren't on the surface as much, but you could easily have seen American shad. They're the bigger ones. When they see a big silvery fish go by, those are often the American shad, because they're, again, will be a good bit larger than all the other herring in the river.
Great. But then there's another question about if there are any other rivers on the coast that are kind of following in the footsteps of the Potomac that are maybe starting out conservation programs or seeing similar success.
Yeah, there are, and there right now, actually, the United States Marine Fisheries Commission is taking a coast-wide assessment of the shad stocks. So when their report comes out in a few months or a year or whatever, I'll know better. I don't keep in constant contact with every river up and down the East Coast, but I know the Delaware has been improving because we helped some of the shad from the Potomac went to the Delaware, and we worked with folks there on the Delaware, and I keep track of that, and they're seeing improvements. Some of the North Carolina rivers are doing a little bit better. The James River was doing better. The Rappahannock River exceeded its goal. They quit stocking the Rappahannock River in 2014 because it reached its restoration goal for that 1 year. So yeah, there's some other, but to me, the Chesapeake Bay is a river. when we're talking about these different river systems. And again, I want to see not only the other rivers in the bay, but the rivers coastwide doing better.
Great. Then there was another question about the migration. It looks like Chris provided some information in the chat, but if you want to talk a little bit about that, they come in the spring for the shad run, and then in terms of when do they go back out to the ocean?
Yeah, well, the adults come in to spawn starting sometimes even in early March, depending on the different years, but generally the big time is end of March, early April to middle of May. And then the adults out migrate once they've spawned. Some of them, again, succumb to spawning, but they out migrate. I've even heard of some shads sticking around, the odd ones stick around even into July, but that's really unusual. But the young of the year then, they hatch in April, May, and then they start growing and they out migrate. They start turning from a freshwater fish, because they're freshwater fishes as these young fish, and then they have to become a saltwater fish, just as their parents had to become from a saltwater fish to become a freshwater fish. That's quite a transition, because salt and freshwater are really different on osmotic gradient of your gills. But at any rate, the young out migrate starting in late July, but again, the peak of it kind of is going on late August and September and into October. And I've even heard some reports where there might even be some shad that stick around later, but not many of them. Most of them go out to the ocean, out of the bay, into the ocean, head south, because again, when the adults leave the bay, they head north. They go up to Maine to spend the summer, but the young leave in the fall and they head south to go to warmer waters down south. So that's sort of it in a nutshell.
Great. All right, looks like we've got time for maybe one more question here. We have a question about if there are other fish species that might benefit from this type of restoration project.
From this type of restoration project, yeah, there's a big controversy now about hatcheries. A lot of hatcheries have gotten kind of a bad name because they've been misused. They're often stocking trout for put and take trout fisheries, or non-resident, non-native fish stocking, things like that. And those are definitely not good things, but this kind of restoration efforts, the hatcheries are really good at it. And I'd say another one of similar is the freshwater mussels that that we're starting to freshwater mussels. The same kind of thing. We raise them in the hatcheries. They're in the hatcheries, they're protected, and then you put them in the river where they can again start to do their jobs in the river and be happy again in the river. So yeah, freshwater mussels.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Great. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We are just at our a little bit over our 6:30 mark, so we did very well on the time. So thank you very much to all of our speakers, Jim, Sandy, Chris. Thank you all very much. We appreciate it. We did record this tonight, so we will have this available on our website for people who weren't able to make it. So thank you again, everybody.
Thanks, everybody, for listening in.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Andy. Good seeing you guys.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Good to see everyone.